Welcome. Today we're diving into the immunology of the thyroid gland. We're going to explore a fascinating paradox, how this one organ can be the target of two completely different autoimmune attacks, which lead to clinical states that are polar opposites. So let's get right to the heart of it. How on earth does the immune system launch two such different assaults on the thyroid? One that results in hyperstimulation, putting everything into overdrive, and another that leads to total destruction. It really makes you question what's going on with immunological targeting and receptor biology. Okay, before we get into the pathology, it's absolutely crucial that we understand the normal physiology. So let's do a quick recap of how the thyroid is meant to function, basically as the body's metabolic thermostat, all governed by this incredibly precise feedback loop. What we're looking at here is the hypothalamic pituitary thyroid axis, or HPT axis. Think of it as a chain of command. The hypothalamus sends out TRH, which tells the pituitary to release TSH. TSH then acts as the direct order to the thyroid, telling it to produce its hormones, T3 and T4. As the levels of these hormones rise in the blood, they send a signal back to the hypothalamus and pituitary to say, okay, that's enough for now, shutting down the production. It's a beautiful self-regulating system. So what happens when this elegant system of self-recognition goes wrong? Well, that's the very basis of autoimmunity. It's a fundamental breakdown in tolerance where the immune system gets its wires crossed and can no longer tell the difference between self and other. And in the diseases we're talking about today, that leads to a targeted civil war right on the thyroid gland. Right, so now we get to the real fork in the road. We have these two major autoimmune thyroid diseases, Graves' disease and Hashimoto's thyroiditis, and they're kicked off by completely different immunological weapons, which ultimately seal the gland's fate one way or the other. The crucial difference really comes down to the autoantibodies involved. In Graves' disease, the culprit is an antibody called thyroid-stimulating immunoglobulin, or TSI. This antibody is an agonist. It perfectly mimics TSH, binds to the receptor, and switches it on permanently. In stark contrast, in Hashimoto's, the antibodies are against thyroid peroxidase, TPO, and thyroglobulin, TG. These antibodies don't stimulate anything. Instead, they act like little red flags, marking the thyroid cells for destruction. And this, of course, leads to those two completely different outcomes. With Graves', the constant stimulation from TSI puts the thyroid into overdrive. The factory is working 24/7, pumping out hormones with no off switch. With Hashimoto's, it's a slow, methodical demolition. The gland gets invaded by lymphocytes, and together with those autoantibodies, they cause chronic inflammation and the gradual destruction of the very cells that make the hormones. So, let's connect what's happening at the cellular level with what a clinician actually sees. The unique pathology of each disease creates a very distinct biochemical fingerprint, and you can see it plain as day in the lab results. This table sums it up perfectly. In Graves' disease, because the thyroid is pumping out so much T4 and T3, the negative feedback loop goes into overdrive, and the pituitary shuts down TSH production completely. It's often undetectable. In Hashimoto's, it's the exact opposite. As the gland fails and T4/T3 levels drop, the pituitary screams for more by pumping out tons of TSH to try and compensate. And this timeline for Hashimoto's shows just how insidious it can be. In the beginning, even though the immune system is already attacking, there's enough healthy thyroid tissue left to pick up the slack so hormone levels look normal. Then, as more damage is done, you enter this subclinical phase, where the TSH starts to creep up, fighting to keep those hormone levels normal. It's only after years of destruction that the gland finally fails, and you see overt, clinical hypothyroidism. Now, it's really important to remember that this whole process isn't always neatly contained within the thyroid. Let's take a look at how these immune mechanisms can cause some pretty dramatic effects elsewhere in the body, especially in Graves' disease. The mechanism behind Graves' eye disease is all about antigenic cross-reactivity. It turns out that the TSH receptors aren't just on the thyroid, they're also on cells behind the eyes, specifically fibroblasts and fat cells. The same TSI autoantibodies that are overstimulating the thyroid find these receptors in the orbit, bind to them, and kick off a massive local inflammatory reaction. This causes swelling, tissue expansion, and that classic unfortunate sign of proptosis or bulging eyes. And this quote just hits the nail on the head. Because the eye disease is driven by the direct action of the autoantibodies in the orbit, its severity has nothing to do with how much thyroid hormone is floating around in the blood. This explains why you can have a patient with terrible eye symptoms whose thyroid function is perfectly normal.
It also explains why treating the hyperthyroidism doesn't automatically fix the eyes.
So this all leads to a much broader question, doesn't it? Why do autoimmune diseases tend to cluster together? Why is it that a patient with autoimmune thyroid disease is so much more likely to have another autoimmune condition as well? Well, it's really a perfect storm of factors. First, there's a clear genetic component. Certain HLA gene types, like HLA-DR3, make you more susceptible. Then you've got an underlying problem with immune regulation itself. Maybe your regulatory T cells just aren't doing their job properly. And finally, you have environmental triggers, things like an infection that can come along and light the fuse in someone who is already genetically primed for it.
So to wrap up the core of what we've talked about today, Graves' disease and Hashimoto's are really just two sides of the same autoimmune coin. Graves' is a disease of inappropriate stimulation driven by an antibody that pretends to be a hormone. Hashimoto's is a disease of slow, progressive destruction. One mimics a signal, the other destroys the factory.
And that really leaves us with a provocative thought for the future. You see, most of our current treatments just manage the hormonal fallout. We either block hormone production or we replace it. But as we get better and better at understanding these very specific immune pathways, you have to wonder, could future therapies intervene much earlier? Could we one day actually steer the immune system away from attack and back towards tolerance and fix the root of the problem itself?